Hi, everyone. Good morning. We'll wait for, or good afternoon, wherever you're dialing in from. We'll wait for some folks to roll in, but really excited to be here today with Ashton Snook, who is the head of design and research at Vodafone. And yeah, really excited for this conversation. Just want to cover a couple quick housekeeping things first. Um, we will be we will be recording the session. It's recorded right now, so you'll get a copy of it. Feel free to sit back and enjoy it, and you can always watch the recording afterwards. And we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions as we're going through for Ash, please drop those as we go in the Q&A box. You should find it along the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. It's just a little easier for us to keep track there. But yeah, I think with that, we can get started. For those who don't know me, my name is Colleen. I live in Boston and I am D-Scout's customer and community marketing manager. So I am fortunate enough to have some great guests, usually around once a month, to have conversations with and hear from all of you as well in our People Nerds community. So with that, I think we can dive in. And I would love, Ash, if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. So as Colin kindly said, I'm Ash. I'm one of a small handful of design leaders at Vodafone Group. For those of you who don't know Vodafone, particularly if you're in the States, Vodafone is a global telco. We are in, I think, 69 countries. We support about 300 million global customers. And we have a really simple belief, which is that connectivity can be a force for good. And my mission and the team's mission is very much to bring that to reality. Today, very excited to be sharing some insights and having a good chat with Colleen.
Yeah. So our conversation today will be, as Ash said, really kind of centered on how design can move beyond delivery and into things like, strategy, direction, impact, as well as future readiness, and what it looks like when design is really part of that leadership strategy at an org. So with that, let's get into it. I know you gave, a brief overview of Vodafone, but I would love if you could set the scene a little more for folks who might not know, kind of like what's the, scale and scope of what your design and research team does at Vodafone.
Sure, of course. So I should say there is, we're a large company. I might get the exact figure wrong, but just under 100,000, I think. And as I mentioned before, we're supporting 300 million customers, so we're quite a big beast. My team is a very small subset and a smaller subset of Vodafone Group. We're around 50 people collectively. We're supporting around 20 product lines. And the core team that I support is around 15, 16 people right now. So we've got the joy of sort of working both on horizontal and vertical initiatives, which is really exciting. So I spent a good deal of time working with my folks on building out consumer products for anything from buying phone insurance to home connectivity. And as part of that community, we also look at a lot of horizontal stuff. So we run a ton of programs on how basically to bring the value of design to the discussion at Vodafone, how to enable the team, what the creative look and feel should look like on our digital experiences. And we're working as one of those, one small cog in a very large machine to try and build something quite exciting in a category that is very much a commodity in this day and age.
Yeah. It's also just such an interesting structure. I feel like so often you don't hear of both like the vertical and horizontalness that you were just describing in terms of structure. Um, so who would you say like your core partners with that you're working with across both, vertically and horizontally?
Yeah, great question. I mean, without doubt, the product team. I mean, they are very much our partners in crime, and we tried to shake things up a little bit, always with the customer at heart. So we at Group we operate in it's sort of semi-complex world, I suppose, if compared to some other organizations that have been worked with. So we work as a group function to figure out the right strategies alongside markets. And markets operate in a full stack kind of way. So we're a federated business. It's probably a good way to describe ourselves. And between design, research, and products, we very much work with those markets, wider suppliers and stakeholders to understand what we should build, like is it the right pitch, how do we bring it to market, what should it look like, how should it behave, how people respond. And the latter part is very much where design partner with product. We don't get too involved in the commercials. We very much focus on the customer there.
Amazing. And so I think if we, rewind a little bit to, you've been with Vodafone for, I feel like quite some time.
5 years.
Um, 5 years, yeah. So I'm curious of how kind of design was positioned within the business then and how that's like since evolved to where you are now.
Yeah, yeah, great. So it's an interesting one. I joined Vodafone as into a consumer IoT branch, subdivision, whatever you want to call it. And design was we operated in, a pretty unique way, I think, in the wider Vodafone community. When we sort of wrapped that investment down, we moved the talent over to Vodafone Group. We already had a relatively large and well-established function, but it felt very much, and I'm sure some colleagues will find me for the exact situation, it felt much like design didn't really play a strategic role. Like many organizations, design was somewhat there to do as instructed by product. And it felt very much to me and some colleagues of mine that we were missing a key opportunity to have a deeper discussion. And thankfully, we had some really great sponsors in the SLT who also observed this trend. Design could do a lot more than just make things look good and put together wireframes and build prototypes. We could push back, we could challenge assumptions, we could, with our research team, ask the tough questions that allowed us to, test, prototype, and iterate the proposition early on. And for us, that was all risk mitigation against the investment, and then that cash could be utilized to empower us to build the right thing that customers actually wanted to play with. And that's kind of how we started to look at it. So there was a semi-mature establishment of design and research, but it was quite fragmented. It didn't really have the foothold that we hoped it could do. And we sort of set about over the first year or two starting to make some big waves and change that role.
Yeah, I feel like it's so interesting to hear you like describe some of that as part of your role being connected to risk mitigation in terms of like getting these insights earlier versus like taking only assumptions to market. And it's something that, is brings such business value, but maybe is like a little undersung of like the planning for the things that have not yet been invested in so that, maybe money isn't wasted and you can tweak things before they're finally brought to market. But that kind of shift you're describing from more of like agency or delivery model to being more of like a strategic partner to product. I feel like it's something that a lot of orgs, you know, might want, but haven't actually been able to get there with their design teams, like having that seat at the table with product. Other than, having like that excellent like buy-in from some of your like SLT teams, is there anything else that's really like helped your team like get to be a little more embedded with product?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to relationships and communication style. I remember this is way before Vodafone, but I was building a design function at another brand, and we had been doing, I think we're like year two, year three cycle of doing some really great work, and I found myself in what do we call it now? Like a crisis management and priority training course, which so we had a guru who would go in and work with, say, like the UK government on how to respond to a crisis. So a really fascinating session. One of the activities was here are a series of cards on the table, who can affect what? And there was one card on the table which was like the solvency of the organization. So essentially, am I responsible for making sure the company lives or dies? And I was one of only like 12 leaders and probably the youngest leader in the team who went, yeah, of course, that's my role as well. And everyone else sort of went, oh, no, that's their job or that's someone else's job. And it dawned on me that design could have a degree of influence and people could get excited about it and they realize, oh, it's quite exciting and it has an influence over the customer. That means that people want to use our products and spend more money and therefore good business. But clearly it wasn't really a strategic partner. And if we wanted the company to survive and thrive, then it was also my responsibility as a design leader to contribute to that fiscal element. And I think that was a real game changer, it's like a light bulb moment to go from just making things look and feel better to challenging and being, a bit of a devil's advocate in discussions to drive strategy. And I sort of carried that mindset forward. So I think a large portion of great design leaders recognize that you have to be able to speak business lingo. We are great visual communicators. Researchers are great storytellers, and together we're kind of a powerhouse. But there's often this friction. I found this working a ton of different teams that it's always an us and them. oh, the business guys, they don't get what we do. And that's kind of true to a degree. I mean, it's a bit like sitting down with your parents and explaining what you do as a job. Like it's always hard, right? Oh, what do you do as a design manager? What does that mean? What do you do as a marketer? What does that mean? And so you have to put the effort in. But I feel it's really very much the key from just being someone who makes things look nice for a product manager to being a partner with a product manager is being able to test their ideas and bring them into your process so you can start to build that shared vocab.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, like I know from our chats, your team in so many ways is like the keeper of customer insights of there's so much you know about your end user. So it makes total sense that other folks in the org kind of like want in on that since it is so valuable. Um, and I think, you obviously know that design is so impactful to a business, and that's also echoed in research from McKinsey and then the Design Council in the UK. But sometimes it still feels like some companies don't like fully get it of like why design is not just there to make things look nice, but also has this broader role. Why do you think that is?
It's a question I ask myself almost every day. It's fascinating, and I mean, the crazy thing is we all recognize not just like from a literal point of view, we can see companies that succeed because they have great products or great brands, but we feel it when you ask anyone on the street what brands do you associate with being good? Airbnb, Uber, Apple, Nike, Beats. Like there's a small handful that people get really excited about, and they almost get cult-like around. And it's not just brand, like the overall experience, the design of the entire product through to its packaging, through to its marketing fits into the zeitgeist. And I think that's really exciting. Strangely, loads of organizations, maybe it's because they don't understand design, perhaps there's a fear or a sense of what they're doing is not that interesting. They sort of turn off. You could speak to someone and try and pitch them why you should spend the extra, month or the extra 10 grand on a project and they'll go, "Oh no, we're not going to do that because of X, Y, Z." At the same time, you can see that they've got themselves the latest iPhone and they're wearing the latest pair of Jordans, and so they understand why design means something to them as an end user. And I think the challenge is a lot of its perception. There's obviously a language barrier, but there's this perception that you can't do. And again, it's super multifaceted, but you can't turn something that's kind of dull into something exciting. Well, Google and searching, like really, if you break it down, pretty boring. Booking a car, Uber have made that exciting. Booking a house, really laborious and not very fun. Airbnb have made that exciting. So there's like so many examples out there. And for some reason, there seems to be a hang up where people look at categories and go, oh, that's terrible. I mean, Monzo in the UK is a great example, which is a fintech company that turned getting a mortgage or saving with your friends and family into something that people think is not just fun, but cool. And it's banking. So I think it's trying to get people over that hurdle to say, okay, even an insurance company or a B2B brokerage company could still make a difference and you can have fun with the experience. And then you've got the literal business blocker, which is what is the return on my investment? And that, as we all know, for anyone who works in design research, is very, very hard to trace from start to finish because there are so many people in the production line, as it were. Um, and so it's a case of, well, how do we look at, some external factors, as you mentioned, things like McKinsey's report or the Design Council, balance that with early investment, and the early investment is in that critical customer research, and bring those folks in. So, if we try and recap on that, 3 points is external factors are super important, reminding people that great brands exist because people love the products that they build. The second is very much around that early investment and getting them involved. And the third pillar I would say is around business language, understanding that people need to figure out that you're either saving them money or making them money, and how you can attribute that to the work that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we'll spend some time today kind of talking about, proving design's value to the extent that we can and what those different factors are. Um, and I know something that's a little bit of a kind of a callback to one of your pieces that you published on LinkedIn was kind of talking about, um, you know, with investment, smaller team can also have like the right mindset and they can really like outperform a team that's maybe scaled too fast. Have you ever like what have you seen that makes that true?
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so much stuff out there in the wider community, from like loads of startup blogs to investor blogs. I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like the 8-person pizza rule. Like there's so much rhetoric and you could argue evidence around smaller teams being more effective. In my own experience, I've gone through building teams for I think it was 7, 8 years now, and we've often found that there are financial pressures on a company, and we've gone through phases up a super growth and scaling back down. And I feel that when you've got the right balance, and I think balance is the key word, the right tension between being motivated to succeed and just a little bit stressed, but not so stressed that you're going home feeling exhausted. People find this flow, this rhythm that works. And I feel that when you've got the right curated group of people with the right challenge and the right support from the leadership team, they will move mountains. And throwing people at a problem, I've never found to be successful. From a financial point of view or in terms of the product outcomes that you drive. So I'm a massive believer in the right size team, and sometimes that might be 100 people, but more often than not, it's a small handful, half a dozen or two people, uh, with a real sense of purpose and a clear shared value as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of shifting into that is um, kind of like positioning and moving on to the proof points of,
Mm.
I guess, speaking in terms of as a design leader, you certainly have to, I'm sure, speak to the value of your team's work frequently. How is design at Vodafone currently like delivering in like measurable business impact ways?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's like what I would describe as the exciting stuff, the things that as creators and research we get really passionate about. Which you've got an example on the screen there, which is our clarity framework, and we should certainly dive into that. The
Yeah.
other side of it is the stuff that I think most people get turned off by, which is you've got to you've got to watch the pennies, or for anyone in the States, the dollars and the cents. Like, you can have the best ideas, and most of the best ideas, as you get more experience, become quite pragmatic for what could be delivered and engineered. Um, but people want to see that fiscal responsibility. So as a design leader, you need to manage your creativity and influence over your team to push them out of their comfort zone, and at the same time, be able to sit there in meetings and work through. And I spend possibly more time than I'd like to on spreadsheets, like actually figuring out how you can negotiate the best contracts, how you can retain talent, where to invest, where not to invest. Essentially run the design team as if it's your own business. I find is the best way to prove to the wider community who are perhaps more commercially orientated that you're doing the best effort possible to provide them with a service that is at a good cost. And then the more exciting side of things for anyone on the call probably is proving the customer value, which we all know is super hard. And there are so many different metrics that we can all measure, from the one that is a staple love-hate relationship from NPS, which thankfully we don't have to get involved with, but a very highly debated sort of criteria, through to things like CES. Um, we found ourselves at a time and place where we were challenged by some of our sponsors to look at how we could, in inverted commas, quantify the qualitative insight. And myself, my colleagues, Nick and Georgie, we really scratched our head. We thought this was going to be really hard to do. And it kind of was initially. But what we found, and actually, Colin, as you know from the work we've done with you guys at Dscout over the last couple of years, that was a really great challenge because it forced us to think about why we would want to do that. Well, a lot of the time, stakeholders are time poor. So it's really unrealistic to ask a product manager to spend all of their time sat on every interview and to be actively involved in every aspect of the program of work. That becomes almost impossible when you elevate that up to their leadership team or to the leadership team above. They're managing huge quantities and complex problems on a day-to-day basis. And so we found ourselves in a position where we had to ask, why would we want to build a framework and what would that look like? Then we had to talk about how do we measure that in a way that felt, you know, objectively true. Um, but how would we do that from a consumer's own, point of view? And how would we then apply an expert lens to that? And we went through, an absolute ton of development on this. And what we ended up creating was something we call clarity, which is essentially 3 key metrics, which you can kind of see on screen there. So the first is the customer proposition score that we outlined. And this was because we were building, so we set up a sort of R&D stroke innovation service that would allow us to look at sort of near-term discussions and long-term investments. And so how do you prove out a really cost-effective and time-efficient manner if an idea is good or bad? Because there can be a tendency for organizations to take an idea and to feel because the hippo in the room, the highest paid operator, has come up with that idea, you have to execute. And well, that's, what are we here for with research? We want to mitigate the risk of the investment and make sure it's the right idea before we go and spend more time and money. And the further you go down the pipeline, the greater the sunken cost, the harder it is to pull back out of the build. So customer proposition score is really just about asking how valuable the idea is to a customer. Then we obviously imported CES, which is the customer effort score. How effective was the design for them to interact with, to achieve from goal to completion. And those were the two self-reported metrics that we created on a Likert scale. So is the idea good? Independent of the design, most importantly. So the idea can be really good, but the design could be sucky, or vice versa. The idea was terrible and the design couldn't perform better given the parameters of the task. And those were self-reported. And then the third element we added in was the user experience score we've got there. I think we've now changed it to user expert score because that is then the researcher and the designer overlaying their own observations on top of that. And that allows us to mitigate that say-do gap. So that in itself has been a really impactful framework because we can sit down and in the first 2 minutes of any presentation, we can say, here was our problem space. Here's the people we spoke with. Here's how they scored it. And you can give people what feels like a very clear guidance of, okay, this either performed really poorly and we need to start again, or this performed really well and we feel confident. And then people can dial out if they need to. They've got the answer. And then, of course, crucially, we go into the detail of what do people actually say and do and what are the problems, areas, and opportunity spaces. But I think that balance between that commercial mindset of how do we run a business and then how do we validate the value of design through the consumer's lens is the balance you kind of need to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're gonna go in a little deeper on this really thoughtful internal measurement model that you just outlined. But before we move on to that, I would love to kind of hone in a little on the commercial aspect of like as as you're using these metrics to communicate up the chain to the C-suite, folks who don't live every day in design or research or even in the customer experience, even if maybe they want to, but they don't. Kind of like what remains to be the biggest hurdle, even as you've had this model now for around 2 years?
That's a great question. I think the biggest blocker to further investment, or the challenges we face is sort of universal at the moment. I think it's time and finances. So, you know, most individuals are spending a huge period of their time looking at metrics across the organization. And they're, looking at either reducing costs or increasing revenues, the kind of the two basics to running any company. And I think there's for us to get greater attention. I feel like a child asking for mum and dad, hey, look at us, which is not what I mean. But for us to get more attention on the things that we're really passionate about and our metrics, it's about respecting people's time and finding an opportunity that allows them to support their mission. So what we try to do, and Vodafone's really good at, is creating cascading goals. So that gave us that step hold for us to then ladder up our goals with the leadership team above me, and so on all the way up to the top of the company. That was a bit of a step change in us being able to remove some of the barriers and show the value because again we're attaching to a commercial goal. Thankfully, under Margarita's leadership, so our global CEO, customer is one of the three main strategic pillars. So that changed a couple of years ago, and we've then had that opening to basically build up a bit more profile and get more involved in communicating the strategy. But the reality is of all companies, we can tend to look at our brand as a homogenous group of people, but everyone has different pressures and challenges and different personalities. And so whilst we have a framework, it allows us to have a script with a shared language and a shared set of values and beliefs. Of course, there's always the day to day, and the reality is spending time with people and making sure they know you and understand what you bring to the table and how you can support their mission. Is really, I think, the detail of getting that right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's kind of like click in a little more on these three metrics that make up your framework. If you want to walk us through, kind of how it came together, what it measures. I know for folks who maybe weren't there this time last year. Actually, Ash and I, as well as a few other folks, Nick and Georgie from the Vodafone team, were on a session last April where you kind of did much more of a full 45-minute deep dive into like the development of this and the adaptation for Vodafone. Which is wild to me, but that's been a year. But would love to kind of dive deep again, especially I do already see a few questions in the chat of kind of like clarifying the differences between these three scores and how they work together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I gave a pot of history, but I'll recap just briefly. So we're now on the detailed segment. So the challenge was, how do we prove that design is essentially performing effectively through the product development lifecycle? Below the hood, there was also a, how do we show that design is performing well at the point of concept? And then how do we observe if that same quality stays true as we go through the development cycle and then into market? Or are there other factors that would potentially influence that? And there's this, I can't remember who published it. It was something I saw on LinkedIn where we started at where the sketch started out with a masterpiece, an old master's piece of artwork. And as it went through the product development life cycle, it turned out to be a stick man drawn by a 3-year-old. And that is most people's experience in design, and I would say of how they feel that their ideas end up going to market. Now that's thankfully not entirely true for us at Vodafone. Like we build better things than that. But I think it illustrates the risk and concern that people have in the design community, that an idea can be amazing at the point it's conceived. First of all, then how do we validate that's true? And then how do we track and benchmark that remains true or it changes through the product development lifecycle based on either economic and external factors, or it could be something simple like engineering quality degrades. And so we had this challenge of, how do we do that? And then how do we make it simple so it could be understood by anyone in the company? How is it accessible so everyone can speak in the same way? And then how do we make that in a way that can be replicable? Like we want to be able to do this across multiple studies. So if we test the design once and then we iterate, can we test that again? Or can we test, an ABC version of a design and then measure that? And then historically speaking in research, particularly when you're in the development stage of products, it's hard to do that because you're just relying on people's observations. You or I would sit in a room and we would say, oh, we think that person did that. Let's group some Post-it notes together and that looks great. But it felt very subjective. And when you're dealing with the wider business and the people who influence, where money goes, really care about metrics. And those metrics are much harder. And so the soft metrics that we get through Qual, even though it's a deeper, richer, arguably perhaps more valuable insight, is harder for people to grasp because they spend their lives worrying about the bottom line. And we don't worry about that. So that's sort of part of history. As you can see on the slide now, we've got these three metrics: customer proposition score, customer effort score, and the usability expert score. I'm glad we got that right off the slide. Apologies for the last. And it's really simple, that we wanted to be able to dissect the problem space. So the first one is, are we designing the right thing? Was as simple as that. We have an idea that we want to go and build X product. And is that concept, that idea of a thing, worth spending any more time on? And if you go down traditional market analysis routes, it could take several months. It can be very expensive, and there's definitely a role for that to be played, for sure. I'm not saying we should get rid of that, but we also found that there were perhaps more nimble opportunities for us to close that feedback loop, and obviously that means greater utilization of assets and resources and greater efficiency on time. And so we started to challenge, is this idea good enough? And if it's not the right idea, let's not go into the execution phase. Now, what we also found over time is that having visual STEM to represent an idea helps you answer the proposition query. But then very quickly, thank goodness to things like Figma and us having a mature design system, we could build out STEM that would allow us to then assess the quality of the execution. And of course, CES has been around for a long time. We spent a ton of time analyzing options in market, and we just felt it was the simplest thing that we could introduce at the beginning of the pipeline and then take through the pipeline and then out to market. So if we want to survey the CES, that's great. We can do a touch point NPS, which is like a targeted survey, and we can introduce the Likert scale. How well, is this, do you agree with this statement? Okay, it's really bad or it's really good, or somewhere in between. And so the second one focuses on, are we designing the thing right? And so you get this sort of dichotomy, this challenge between, okay, in a stakeholder's mind, I think my idea was really strong, but obviously the idea is so good the design was the problem. And in the designer's mind, you get my design could not have been better. Obviously, the idea should have been stronger. And both are kind of true. And so the two scores allow you to segment and observe and then critically analyze which parts are performing and which parts need more revision. And then finally, we introduced, after a bit of how many months it was of experimentation running this program, we realized that, of course, we don't want to cut the expert out of this. We actually really feel it's critical for the research team and the designers, and for the product managers to some extent as well, to play an active role in sharing their observations. And that, if we roll back sort of 10 years ago, maybe 15, like the idea of getting people into two meeting rooms and one meeting room, you would have, and this is pre-D-Scout, obviously, and other decent competitors of yours. You would stream into the next room and people would sit there and observe and put post-it notes up on the wall. And so there's still that buy-in that works. And so we wanted to carry that through, but also have that expert lens. And so how well does our design really work was us recognizing that a customer could say, I love the design and I love the idea, but we observed a struggle. So we will then provide an independent score. Again, on the Likert scale, I think we do a 1 to 7 scale. And we'd say, okay, the customer's given that a 6.5 out of 7. So that means it's extremely good, probably no need to revise. In reality, we saw them struggle at certain points in the journey. So we're going to give our own score of maybe a 4 or 5. And then we've got a balance. And then we'd circle, essentially red pen, the opportunity space. And so you have these three scores that provide self-reported analysis from the customer. And of course, you can then aggregate that together and look at the trends. And then what we observed, and then look at the trends again there. So yeah, it provides granularity, and also, most importantly, it inspires further discussion.
Yeah, thank you for walking through that. I'm curious, and I know some folks in the chat have already asked this too around, um, this is something that is like, really owned by your team, but of course includes your partners in product. How, as you're communicating out these scores and thinking about the next steps when there's the instance of maybe the score is lower than you'd like for it to be, so there's a larger opportunity area, how are those things like kind of taken and actioned by your partners in product or even like engineering in some cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say, I feel like we're a little bit sport in the fact that we've got, basically a really decent bunch of people at Vodafone, and so there's a lot of trust over discipline and expertise in the company. We don't really have, and I've had this in many other places, like really tricky stakeholders who are religiously like, this is going to be the right idea to go for. We don't really have that mentality, so we don't have so many hard barriers that I've faced elsewhere. Um, I suppose how to put it, like, I feel like, speaking candidly, if you're in a team where you can't have a grown-up conversation to say that we have assessed the idea on an agreed format that we will prescribe to and believe this gives us a good indication of this is good or this is bad, then probably that team is not going to change very quickly, and it's always going to be an uphill battle. When you're in an environment where people have got on page review and they understand why you're measuring things, in fact, you're trying to communicate it in a way that is time sensitive, and it's all focused on, pardon the pun, clarity, to provide deeper insight and drive further discussion, you tend not to find that problem. What has happened most times, and there have been instances where we've seen, a dozen or so ideas come forward, and we've been able to, in a couple of weeks, get enough information to change perspective. We'll then get unlock more investment to do more further research. So, okay, the idea is not as good as I thought it would be, but let's have another crack. What else can we do? And so we're going to do deeper research on that. And sometimes that will mean, you spend another month or three on it. Other times, stakeholders will go, you know what? I didn't really feel that my heart was in this idea. So I'm quite glad you've told me to stop, or suggest that I should stop. Not that we tell people, we obviously provide recommendations. Uh, and I think, as long as you can have a decent discussion with anyone in your team and they're open-minded, and thankfully we have that, that group of individuals that are, it's not that big of a problem.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It sounds like at Vodafone, you have this design and research team, but also a lot of like buy-in and like mutual accountability with like product and engineering of being pretty committed to this framework and, you know, being open to making adjustments and like iterations as you're getting feedback from the customers. I know we are already kind of speeding through this, so I want to look ahead a little bit before we shift to Q&A, because I know there's a bunch of questions already that we can dive into during the kind of Q&A time that we have. Um, but I did want to kind of, as I have you here as a design leader, look ahead of like, there's so many changes across design and research more broadly, the way that orgs and teams are structured. I'm curious of, what are you doing to really like prepare your team for the future and all that's changing in terms of like, you know, team structure as well as like AI.
Yeah, yeah. This is an absolute passion area, as I'm sure you and other colleagues in the UK team or the European team have also heard me talk about a bunch of times. So we've been in group for, I think this is my third cycle, so like year three, maybe year four, and I'm very very passionate about building great culture and community for people to be part of because at the end of the day, life is spent, a large portion of it is in work. And so that's been my sort of ground and the main driver for this. When we think about future ready, we started to experiment with, queries of, where's AI going to take us? Like, what's the impact going to be? What does that mean in terms of long-term investment for design? Do teams stay the same? Do they shrink? Do they get bigger? What are the skill sets that we need to have moving forward? And we decided that the best thing for us to do was to build a program of work. So we've got an evergreen program of work called Future Design, and it looks at four strategic programs inside of that. So one of those looks at the consumer's point of view. What are the platforms and the patterns they're going to want to play with? Are things like VR headsets really ever going to take off, and what would the use case ever be for, say, Vodafone? So we've got that aspect to it. We've got an aspect that focuses on community and what are the factors that attract great talent to stay, to grow, or to leave an organization. Um, we've got another fact that is, and the one that's probably most future ready orientated, which is obviously around AI. And that is just jumping off from the third point there, is that's where we spent a bunch of time. About a year and a half ago, AI felt like it was building some momentum, but was going to be more of a shift in terms of tooling. Then about 6 months after that, it felt like, oh my gosh, like it's going to have a huge impact on the creative industries, and thus design and research will probably be impacted. And I think in the last 6 months, whilst there are obviously, for anyone who's sort of tracking the sort of rhetoric and news around AI development, there could be like, oh my goodness, Terminator could come in 2 or 3 years. I think that's very unlikely. But where we are in reality right now is that it's obviously going to disrupt the world of design and research, but I think it's within the creators and the researchers worlds, as well as a company serving to find solutions that will allow them to shape the future together. And I think that's it's mutually beneficial. It's hard to disrupt design without it having a big economic impact. And so it depends what lens you want to apply to this. You can go very, very deep, very, very deep, very quickly, or you can sort of play surface level. And surface level, um, the focus for us is on looking at the right partners to build long-term relationships with from a software provision point of view. Naturally, like most organizations, and what we've seen for our own research, is that many individuals cannot experiment with a lot of the startup technologies, things like Cursor or Lovable, because their employer thinks they're too risky. And of course, if you're like in a regulated industry or you're dealing with IP, yeah, like there's risk there, even though they're super exciting developments. So there's a balance for us there. And then I think almost as interesting as the tooling, because I think that's just going to constantly evolve, is what are the skills and areas that we think are most defensible, let's say, for humans to capitalize on. And I think there are clear touch points through the process where those make sense. And there are other things like, ideally, when AI gets more mature, and obviously you guys at Dscout amongst some other folks as well are doing a great job there, is on things like, what are the tasks that we don't really enjoy? I don't really enjoy spending a week analyzing a whole bunch of data. So that's where AI can supplant us. So we're very much investing across this program of work on what design looks like, but it is super multifaceted. So you tell me where you want to steer, and I can jump into a particular corner.
Yeah, I think, if we kind of shift, I guess, more like tactically around like what are the your team members that are coming to you asking of like, oh, all these things are happening, like what can I do to be ready, other than, of course you have the shared like program of work, but in terms of like skills that they can be investing in and like kind of learning certain tools to be like trying out and using, whether it's on their own time or at work, like where are there any that you've found to be like particularly fruitful?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, yes and no, I think is the real answer. So I mean, I'm encouraging everyone in our team, and I have to say I've got the mindset to go for it, but with two young kids, and a busy job, I honestly don't make as much time as I want to or should do to experiment, with using the tools. Maybe that's not expected in my role, but I'm super excited about being able to take an idea and design it, at least, and maybe even prompt initial concepts and then deploy with low code tools or even with no code tools. And I think that's a real game changer. But what it quickly brings us to is a discussion on role evolution and boundary blurring. So I think I've written some essays recently which play with this narrative, which is deliberately slightly divisive. So I think in a design world, it seems most likely that designers are going to capitalize on more research activities. And I think that, like being candid with this community, we know that market research and UX research are often areas where it's kind of hard to get long-term investment. You see teams often hire really aggressively, and then in a year or two, there's a fiscal challenge on a company, and those teams are seen as, oh, they're kind of, the product manager or designer can kind of get away with that. And that's really hard for the research community to weather, and providers as well, like yourselves. And what becomes more apparent is, well, then you need to move upstream if you're in research to the higher, more complex value offerings and challenges that a designer couldn't easily deliver upon. And I actually think it's a really good opportunity for researchers to start playing a critically strategic role and probably becoming like this is a terrible way to describe it, Colleen, but like a super product manager. I think the fact that researchers are so passionate, and like if we look at all the people in our team and all the surveys that we do in the community, are so passionate about research as a craft and particularly making sure the customer's voice is heard, I think they would make phenomenally good product managers. You just need to learn the commercial side of things, and maybe, for some researchers, better communication skills. But I think that's a good trajectory. I think for the design side of the discussion, it's somewhat similar, but for this year, for example, we are getting all of our product design team trained up on a sort of a lower grade seat on DScout, to conduct sort of lower level research, usability testing. And there's people would refer to that as democratizing research. I don't think it is. I think it's about providing the designers with the right skills to tackle problems that they feel more comfortable to, and feel more comfortable adapting to, than they would do, for example, trying to figure out how to run a multi-market complex quant study. Like they would just freak out and it wouldn't work for them. But if it's about them trying to validate their ideas or colleagues' ideas at a prototype level, it seems like something that they would get into. And actually, we know it is because we surveyed our team, for over a year on like where would you want to invest skills. And so I think we'll see the designer role also transform. And on peripheral to that, you've then got engineering that can bleed into design and product that can bleed into design and research. And I think we're going to start to see in the next couple of years, particularly teams that are newer or perhaps more ambitious, that sort of, grouping of design, engineering, product, and research blur into new roles. And I think that's the kind of thing we're starting to experiment with. What would that look like in the future? And what are the skill gaps that we need to evaluate? And what are the things that we just need to say we can hand over to technology? Like marking up a design file is something that I spent literally years of my life doing. It's redundant. That's not really a skill. It's like looking at architecture. 100, not even that long ago, back in the 50s, you would see 200 people in a giant warehouse sketching out on paper. And today, CAD does all of that and it's one person. And I think we're at that point now in technology where not perhaps as dramatic, but we're going to go for an evolution. And so we're trying to figure out the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be such an interesting inflection point, especially as, I mean, over the last few years, we've already really seen those kind of lines blend between research and design, but even what you're saying with, from research and design also over to product and engineering to an extent, will be really interesting. But to wrap us up, before we go to Q&A, is something that you had said as we were chatting, in preparation for the session was something along the lines of like there's nothing that really like build empathy than hearing from customers firsthand. And so as your team is really like evolving and expanding to be much closer to the customer in terms of, your designers are also getting seats and doing their own usability testing with customers. What do you expect to be kind of like the impact of having not just researchers, but now designers being that much closer to like, real customers?
Yeah, I think it's gonna might sound a bit washy, but I think self-reflection's a really important driver for me. We can get really excited as a design function about our ideas and how things should look and feel. And what typically happens, the probably the less seasoned you are as a professional, is that you do put a lot of personality and a lot of yourself into your work like an artist. And actually, as you get more seasoned and more experienced in industry, you start to think more objectively, more like a scientist. And I think what's really interesting about giving designers access to research, it allows them to take greater risks in shorter cycles at a lower cost in a way that helps them upskill and build empathy at the same time. So it's for me, it's like it's unlocking so much value. And the idea would be for us that we would massively increase our sort of general velocity and capacity to test. We're going to shorten those cycle times. And that, in theory, means that the product manager and the designer can take greater risks upon themselves to say, let's just try something that's wild that we would not normally feel would be palatable in the time frame, because the risk is relatively cheap. And then if it doesn't work, we can pivot. And so the idea is essentially we've given people as this the sort of stability and support network of being in a large enterprise community, but with a somewhat startup mindset on experimentation. And I think from running some of my function like that over the last couple of years, um, it's unlocked like huge gains in where we were going with the product evolution, and we're doing that at mass across the entire team. We're quite excited about what the potential outcomes could be.
Yeah, I feel like it could really be like such a game changer to have designers as part of like the customer storytelling that your team does more broadly.
Hmm.
Well, we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to shift us over to questions here. Let me just pull up the Q&A box on my screen. Um, Excellent. So we have a question from Daniel. Thanks, Daniel. Of how did your SLT sponsor support you to gain access to like more of the seat at the table kind of model that you have now at Vodafone? What do they do, or like what did you do to initiate that to make it happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, again, sort of top down, bottom up. So we had a great sponsor that is possibly one of the most incredibly intelligent people I've met, can hold detailed knowledge across like 50, 60 different concepts at once. Like they were just an absolute mind box of genius, really, with the amount of stuff that they could get their teeth into. They also happen to be an artist as a way to express themselves, and they would buy and trade art as well. And so there was this natural affinity to say, okay, we've got this big, complex, really, diverse business, but we're also building things that are kind of, on the face value could be dull, like device insurance. It's not particularly, you know, it's not a project that's saying we're going to put someone on Mars, right? It feels quite bread and butter. Um, but they wanted a team to exist that could push sensibility and taste and drive innovation. And I think that was partly because of that individual's profile. Like they were excited about technology and they were very smart and they loved art. And so that was a great natural in. And then from my point of view, my colleague's point of view, I think it was a clear recognition and demonstration of the team setup that we inherited could do a lot more. We found opportunities to look at it from a cost point of view, a creativity point of view, and a way for us to pitch a whole series of ideas, from changing our design language to be, more revolutionary, even in the face of the investment, through to us wanting to build an in-house research capability, for us to be able to scale that, for us to introduce an innovation wing, and not just for the sake of it, but because we needed a team that could work uh, like a special forces squad that could tackle any problem that came into them on demand. And so what we found was we aligned with the stakeholders' interests. We had our interests, which luckily sort of matched, and we built the capabilities that supported the stakeholders with what they were looking for. And once we had proven ourselves, that gave us the right to ask for more and to pitch for investment in other areas that we were more passionate about, like building community and skilling up the team.
Yeah, that leads in really nicely to a question from Peter. Thank you, Peter, for, what are the mechanisms by which you've, you know, proved that of like, connected design to the business value and like shown your worth as a team? Um, and kind of like what has led to that like maturation of the team where you're kind of like able to really easily communicate this out.
I think simply put was bringing people into the journey. So I think there was this is perhaps not entirely true across every team, but there tended to be a pattern of the designer is there to visualize my ideas, and so I'll treat them like a ticketing resource, and they will pick up a ticket and just do what they wanted to do. And there was no real confidence in a design function when I came into group for that matter. They just felt like they were there to execute. Um, I guess the first part was that I was just sort of bold and I felt that this was entirely the wrong way of doing things. And I told people candidly, with respect, I don't think this is the way to go to unlock, real creative capability for the business. And I did a bit of demonstration for some previous programs I'd run in other parts of Vodafone. And that gave us sort of a foothold for people to build some initial trust. Then we started incorporating, we democratized research to a degree that we started getting the product managers really actively involved in customer research. That was going on for a couple of months and then coincided with a strategic change from the very top of the organization that customer is now a pillar. So we'd laid some softer foundations that were starting to sort of mature. And then it came from up high that we need to focus on customer. Obviously, we all know that, right? We want to, but we tend to forget in large organizations that we're here to build things that people actually want to buy and spend time on, not just drive revenue. And so we were already in that place where people had started to get the trust because they were seeing that sort of reflection, that insight on a one-to-one basis with customers when we were testing ideas, and it sort of just built from that point. So I think there's a degree of being bold and being candid with people in a way that's respectful. And as a professional, you should really have some data points to prove that. Realistically, you can say something like the design council. I think it's for every pound invested in design, you generate something like £20 increase in revenue. Like that seems absurdly good. But you can go look at it, and these are the government advisors for the UK. So like they've been around for 30 plus years, maybe longer. That sounds like a great data point. But most people and most businesses are going to go, really? Meh, it's a report. So again, unless they're looking for that proof point to validate their own assumptions and ideas, that's a challenge. But it's a start, it's a way to start. I think getting people into the room with a design and seeing how people respond to that design is not new news, but I think it's really important.
Yeah. Julie has a question about incorporating the three metrics framework. How do you incorporate that scoring into your workflow and like the org sprint cadence?
It's a great question. So we include it at every study that we do when we're validating an idea or a design. So we've spent a bunch of time sort of stepping back from that a little bit, spent a bunch of time looking at how we can build the communication capabilities and skills of our research team and designers to some extent, but predominantly we found that researchers had all this amazing insight and no one was listening. No one could, people would sit in the room, they'd hear it, but they weren't listening. And so we worked with the design function to build out templates and communication styles. We grabbed some stuff, some capabilities that Colleen and the Scout team have on how do we pull out snippets of audio and visual and how do we bring that into the presentation. And then we layered in the score. And so it's constantly an evolving process, but we see each report largely feeling, I suppose, a bit like a pitch, trying to think about it being a 10 to 15-minute session, ideally, particularly when you're engaging very senior stakeholders. You can hold their attention for just enough time. And then it drives further discussion and then having all the rich material below the surface. So I think it's just it's a way of ensuring that you've got framework that as a team what's going to work for your stakeholders, testing it out, and then iterating just like it's any other product.
Absolutely. And another question about the three metrics, Jonathan is wondering, have you managed to link those three metrics directly to pound or dollar outcomes? And if so, how are you able to do this?
The short answer is no, I haven't. I wish I could do that, make life easier. We're in a federated business model, so at group we aren't a P&L. That's that. So that's not the thing that we can necessarily track. Obviously, there's metrics. There's obviously a lot of shared insight, but it's a bit more complicated. And I think even when you're in an organization where you operate as part of the P&L, there are so many factors that will affect if the idea performs as well when it goes to market. I know there's things from like market conditions through to engineering quality, through to Q&A quality. Um, I mean, this is true if you look at very large organizations, even like the top 5 companies in the world, you see stuff go to market with bugs, and obviously that's going to have a downturn on the performance of the product. And that's partly why we created these metrics, because we can't directly or easily, let's say, can't necessarily easily trace a design idea to revenue generated. We can do some work. You could even build like a shadow P&L if you really wanted to. And it's probably an amazing thing to do, but obviously it's really time consuming and expensive investment from a design team to do. But the metrics stand alone to look at the quality of the idea of the product and then the execution from a design point of view. And then ideally you would track that through the development cycle in life and then find mechanisms like the touchpoint NPS survey or targeting surveys to then query that again. So CPS is probably we know is not relevant when you go to market. I mean, you could chuck it in there, but what we focus on as you go down that pipeline of product development is CES. Like, okay, the idea was good, it still performs well, basic metrics are good. Is the quality of the design still performing well when it goes to market? And then you can overlay those harder KPIs, but those KPIs are owned by the commercial team. So it's a case of, bring those both together so you get a richer picture.
Yeah, I think that leads in. There are a couple questions in here that kind of float in the same area that I think I would love to end on in terms of you know, maintaining accountability from concept to delivery of what you're saying of, when something is brought to market and, maybe it's the MVP, it could be better, has some bugs. Um, but what's ultimately delivered falls short. How do you prioritize delivering the rest of the idea?
Yeah, that's it's no easy question because it really depends on the makeup of your team. And ultimately, when it becomes from a design to a product, it's the product management team's responsibility and ownership. So I think you've got to relinquish this absolute obsession or desire as a designer to see things being, pixel perfect. It doesn't work like that really in any business unless maybe you had someone like Steve Jobs, like who was really obsessed about the detail. It would be really hard to do it in most companies. So I think it's recognizing that, taking some pressure off yourself, and then recognizing that there is always compromise. And instead of being part of the problem, be part of the solution. Ultimately, there's no point of just going, hey, here's 100 things that suck about this product launch. Prioritize the things that are most important to you based on the research that you've done. Um, Once you've got through the richer, more complex stuff, then you can work on the detail. So I just, again, think about it like a business plan. What's most important, what's going to have the greatest impact, and then work from there and work with your colleagues, not against them.
Yeah, that's a great place for us to end. I did want to say thank you so much, Ash, for all your time and sharing your insights with us and the People Nerds community. For everyone who has tuned in, you will get a copy of this recording in your inbox. So if you want to share it with your team or rewatch it, you'll have that in a few hours. Also, just dropped some QR codes here for if you want to join our People Nerd Slack community or to follow Ash on LinkedIn. He does post a lot of excellent articles, a little on the provocative side, which I really enjoy. And those were kind of the reason why we wanted to reconvene a year later and kind of continue this conversation. So thank you so much for your time and for everyone for tuning in. And I hope you have an excellent rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks so much, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.